Greetings and welcome to the Emotions Explained Insight series. Today we're going to have a candid discussion about abuse. So why is that? The main reason is that it is so pervasive, and I'm honestly astonished as to how little we talk about it. In fact, I think it's the most important subject that we talk the least about. And there are a number of reasons as to why that might be, but I guess I'm just really surprised that when you look at the news, and that's all you really need to do, just look at the news each day, and you can literally see people engaging in abusive behavior. And maybe we're so used to it that we become desensitized and kind of accept it. And that's really a bad problem, because like anything, when you start to kind of move that threshold and allow things, it's kind of give them an inch and they'll take a mile. At what point can you actually start to curtail it? If a person's been engaging in this behavior for such a long time and has never given any boundaries, they're very likely going to continue to do it. And that kind of really the first part of this video. First thing I want to talk about is identifying it. I think that because of our childhood issues, there are lots of people who are the recipients of abuse and don't push back on it. And that's a big problem for them as well as the abuser. It's bad for them because it kind of enables this notion that they're not of value, they don't matter. People can walk on them and walk all over them and they're going to take it. And they're not worth more. And in reality, no one deserves that. We all have some basic self-worth that we're given as beings. I don't care if you're the biggest loser in the world as far as you're concerned. If you're broke, you constantly make mistakes, can't maintain a relationship, still you are still worthy of some basic dignity. You're still worthy of some respect. Because of your situation, people aren't allowed to talk down to you. And when we start standing, and pushing back on people, that's when things are going to change. So really the first part of this video is to tell people that you need to identify abuse when it's happening. And really you need to call it abuse. Abuse is kind of like this universal word that we all understand. I think everybody understands and really can identify what abuse is. And everyone agrees that it's never acceptable. It is this uniformly bad word, and we know that if you're engaging it, you're doing something wrong. And that's kind of the first part, is to kind of label it as abuse. In concert with that, when we're pushing back on these people, we need to tell them exactly what it is that they're doing. And I have other videos that talk more in depth about it, but there are different types of abuse. There's passive and aggressive, as I define them and as I've seen elsewhere. And each of them has three types. The aggressive types are physical, sexual, and verbal. And these are things that generally require an action for someone to execute in order for that abuse to be present. And we can kind of probably readily identify what that is. At the same time, there are also passive abuse. And that may be a little more subtle and harder to identify, but it can still be equally damaging. And those are the emotional, mental, and economic. And in those cases, it's more about like withholding or not doing something that you should do, and the abuse is as a result of that. For example, withholding the truth, withholding money unless a person does something for you, not telling them what is going on with you, and trying to manipulate them into doing something for you because of maybe a relationship that you have or some other reason. Almost this kind of like emotional extortion. So anyway, the first thing I tell people is that what we need to do is when we're involved in one of these interactions, we need to acknowledge that abuse is going on, that our physical or psychological safety is not being respected. And that's, the basic kind of human right that I was talking about before. We all deserve some basic type of respect. And when we don't get that, it is abuse. Now, it does occur along the spectrum. There is subtle abuse and there is, more severe abuse. For example, with physical abuse, someone maybe just pushing you like that is a form of physical abuse. And we can call it subtle, but still it is not acceptable. It's certainly not as bad as someone, maybe hitting you full force with a punch, but still nonetheless, it's, that gray area that we're talking about, which is it's gone over the threshold and is now abuse. It's doing something that is not appropriate. That person is literally antagonizing you. So what we have to do is after identifying it, and if we have problems doing that, is to understand why from our childhood do we feel so uncomfortable doing it, and recognizing that our not doing it is both hurting us as well as enabling this poor behavior. And the reason that we do that is because of patterns that we got used to when we were growing up. By the time we turn 18 and we become adults, we are not necessarily equipped to be independent and to stick up for ourselves. A lot of people aren't. So if you aren't, I would say, don't necessarily feel bad about it. It is what it is. But nonetheless, we have to stick together and we have to, stick up for ourselves. And that includes learning things that we may not have done in youth, and also identifying what those flaws are. Because in the end, we can excuse it, we can justify our inaction. But in the end, we're not only not helping ourselves or the other person, but we're also making it worse for the next person. Because if we enable bad behavior, that person is going to go ahead and do something to someone else. So you may not even feel that you're worth it or that you matter enough or that it's not, worth the trouble. But sooner or later, that's going to keep escalating with someone else. And we need to kind of, put our foot in the line, the line in the sand. So what are these childhood patterns? And these are really important that we talk about them, because I think when we see what's going on in our childhood and we say, oh, wow, that's not good, that, we understand why we behave certain ways as an adult. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Very typical, for a parent to have their own opinions about things. The problem is that there's right and wrong, but there's also choices. Now, as a child, we're supposed to be allowed to make our own choices. The problem, though, is that when we're not allowed to do that and our parents criticize us or otherwise put us down, right? We then look at it, okay, this is a choice. This is something I'm allowed to do. I'm not allowed to do it. If there's nothing wrong with the choice, like, I don't know, playing a musical instrument, liking this type of music, dressing a certain way, whatever it is, if I'm not allowed to make that choice and it's a perfectly reasonable choice, then there's something wrong with me. And this is how a lot of people learn shame. And what happens in shame is that you get this uneven valuation of yourself versus others. That means that you are somehow less of a person, and what you want to do, your opinions, how you feel, and so on, are less than other people. And that's part of the problem as to why a lot of people are afraid to push back, right? They're like, okay, maybe they're right, maybe I deserve it, maybe they're, it's not important and I shouldn't, make them feel bad. Which of course is ironic, because in the end, we do want to make them feel bad. And not necessarily from a purposeful standpoint, but when someone's engaging in a negative behavior and you point it out to them and they feel bad, great. That's the way emotions are supposed to work. So, kind of using any logic that we might for not presenting our complaint to someone else is a problem for us, and it's something that we need to own. Another reason is that people are afraid of what's going to happen. Is it going to escalate? Are they going to blow up at me, and so on? And at this point, now we're talking about as adults, I have to ask this person, well, why would you stay? Why would you tolerate that, right? If a person is kind of like using this emotional blackmail, right? You're afraid that they're going to blow up because you're pushing back on them. Why do you want to continue a relationship with that person? Clearly, they're not respecting you. And they're literally intimidating you into accepting abuse. So again, you have to take personal responsibility for that, but realize the dynamic of what's going on. And again, that's another very typical scheme that goes on in childhood, right? Our parents don't want us to agree with them, so they kind of bully us into accepting what they want us to do. Not using right or wrong, but I'm talking about these choices. And, them kind of pushing their will in us. You need to pursue this career. Pursuing this career doesn't make any sense, and that's stupid and dumb, and, you need to, make sensible decisions, right? Whatever derogatory comments they may use on that. So it's really important that we, push back on these people, and whatever, reason that we're using for justifying our not pushing back on it, we have to recognize that what we're really doing is we're saying we're afraid. And we have to get over these fears because, like it or not, we have to make others accountable. Our society doesn't work well if that doesn't happen. So other talking points. One of the really important things that happens in society is that we will justify these little transgressions. A perfect example is like I'm watching a press conference of whatever politician, and the way they push back on reporters for asking questions. Reporters are completely, civil and perfectly respectable question, maybe something that makes sense, and somehow they're pushing back on it like that person is wrong for asking that question, when in reality they don't want to answer it, and that's what's really going on. And underscoring this, I kind of want to bring up the notion of what drives a lot of this rhetoric. We have a lot of very destructive rhetoric in our society. And by that I mean is that there are, kind of these cultural beliefs which are not really true. And the question then becomes, why do we have them? And the thing that I'll suggest is that a lot of men are putting forth these, kind of standards to allow them to get away with stuff. A perfect example is, when you're tattling on someone, right? A tattletale is a bad thing. You're a snitch, right? You're a canary. Whatever, a whistleblower has somehow become a four-letter word in our society. But now, look what's going on. What you're trying to do is make someone accountable for bad behavior. That's what you're supposed to do. If we can't do that, we literally endanger all of us. But somehow people are pushing back on that, and it's become part of our cultural rhetoric. And people are like, yeah, you're a tattletale, you're a snitch. Well, I'm going to suggest a couple things. Number one, and I'll emphasize again, that's a male, desire to want to get out of accountability. I'm not saying that women don't do it as well, but it tends to be men who engage in these aggressive behaviors that they want to get away with. And that's why we have this dynamic. The other thing is that we have to recognize is that it is not beneficial to us, right? And what happens is that when people want to let others get away with certain behaviors, what they're in actuality saying is that I want to be able to get away with them too. And that's the problem. So a lot of times when people are saying, that person is, a snitch or whatever, what they're saying is that they don't want to be, called out on their behavior. And to this point, I want to kind of bring up a really interesting point. And that's the notion of privacy. There's a huge push towards privacy today. And granted, I can, maybe come up with some scenarios where privacy is justified. But I want to offer you a very compelling insight into what drives privacy. Guilt and shame. Lots of times when people want privacy, it's because they're not doing the right thing. And their wanting privacy really means that they want to be able to get away with it. They don't want others to know that they're doing something wrong. And that's a problem because in the end, we're paying a price for it. It is a zero-sum game when you're guilty of something and not, being held accountable for it, not receiving consequences, and certainly not repairing or fixing it. So guilt drives a lot of people's interest in privacy and wanting privacy. The other aspect of it is shame. And a lot of people are kind of maybe embarrassed about what they're doing. Now, I'm not talking about people who are doing something wrong. I'm talking about people who are making choices, and their choices are shamed, whatever that might be. Sexuality comes to mind. So they want to keep that private because they're afraid of it. Well, in the end, if we had no privacy, two things would happen. One, people would be forced to deal with their choices. And I'm hoping at that point that they would learn to become proud and accepted of what they do. Because in the end, we all have the right to make a choice. And if someone else doesn't agree with it, they shouldn't have the right to hold it against us. And if you go back to the other component of not having privacy, the people who use it against us, well, now we would know that that's happening. And we can start to kind of get rid of this class system in America that dictates what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Certainly a lot of that being religious-based. In the end, I'll reiterate, from a child all the way up to an adult, we have the right to make choices. And if someone else doesn't agree with that, that doesn't give them the right to bully us, to demean us. If they want to present a logical, civil argument, they can go ahead and do that. But them, kind of putting us down, using it against us as some kind of tactic, and maybe using economic abuse or mental abuse to use what we want to do against us, well, that's just abuse, and we need to call it for what it is. I want to bring up an issue that's associated with abusers, and this is probably I'm talking before about the notion that men propel a lot of this. Now, one aside I want to make is that I talked before about having passive abuse and aggressive abuse. Aggressive abuse tends to be done by men, physical, sexual, and verbal. It doesn't mean that's the exclusive domain, but those, that type of abuse tends to be more associated with men, right? On the other hand, the passive types of abuse, the mental, economic, and emotional, tend to be more something that women are associated with. Although again, plenty of men who do it as well. And the reason I say that is because it is these types of physical abuse, these types of aggressive abuse, they tend to be the ones that are, more justified using the dynamics in society. And let me give you or show you a scheme as to how this happens. A person who is belligerent and has that anger streak, that kind of, that viciousness, that judgmental nature, that persnickety and so on, most all the time that comes from someone who themselves was abused in an aggressive manner. And what happens is that they literally, as a child, didn't learn how to feel good, right? We have 4 hormones, oxytocin, dopamine, I think melatonin, I forget what they are. But we actually have 4 hormones that make us feel good. And when you as a child are abused and certainly are put into a dynamic, a pattern of being abused, you don't learn how to produce those chemicals. And when people talk about having a chemical imbalance as an adult, that's typically the source, is that this person as a child didn't learn what things they need to do to enable these things. For example, when we're abused, we tend to either feel bad or, like I was talking before, feel ashamed, right? We deserve the abuse, there's something wrong with us. As a result, we tend to not do things for us as an adult. And to get these happy hormones, we have to actually engage in activity. We have to socialize with others, we have to exercise and other beneficial things to us. But a person who grows up in an environment where they're abused and taken advantage of, they thought, well, I'm here to serve others, right? I'm not here to do this for myself. And as a result, they don't create these hormones. So what happens is that they walk around feeling bad. And I call this the am I good question. And their answer to that question is, no, I'm not good. I'm inherently bad. And people don't necessarily, think about that. They don't visualize, this, oh, I'm walking around thinking that I'm bad. But what they do is they feel it. They experience that negative sensation or that lack of happiness, that void. And because of that, they feel bad on a pretty regular basis. They get this kind of negative inner critic that is always, hammering into them, you're no good. The problem with that is that it's a double-edged sword. That negative inner critic will make a person really good at things. Whatever they're doing, if it's their job, if it's a sport, if it's a musical instrument they play, that negative inner critic, they're going to constantly be criticizing themselves and pushing themselves for more. But it's not a healthy, criticism. It's a criticism that's never going to be happy. So as a result, a lot of people who are, like I said, belligerent, angry, persnickety, judgmental, they tend to be really good at what they do. And what happens is that in a capitalistic society where performance is so, celebrated amongst everything else, that becomes a problem. Because at this point, if you're a person in a company and you're performing well, you're a star performer, but you have this belligerent nature to you, the company is going to say, hey, if you can get away with it and we can get a reward for it, we're going to allow you to do that. And I'm sure there are probably plenty of people right now who are watching this video who are like, yep, that's my boss. That's my, the owner of my company. That's the CEO. That's this executive and so on. So there's this belligerent leader mentality that gets not only, dispersed throughout capitalism, but also celebrated and almost, enabled in a really dysfunctional way. Other things come into play. When a person is, kind of that domineering personality that goes along with the belligerence, other people are not likely to push back because of the things I was mentioning before, right? They're maybe either, well-adjusted and they don't feel like the confrontation, or they grew up in a household where they were shamed and they were told you don't matter, so they don't stick up for themselves. So as a result, the benefit of a person who is being belligerent and pushing back and kind of beating up people all the time and bullying them is that they remove the defense. That has another benefit to them. That negative inner critic is hammering them all the time, the last thing they want is for other people to be pointing out this belligerence. So if they're bullying other people and pushing back on them, kind of, the best defensive offense, they're less likely to be scrutinized. So you get this amalgam of, side effects that go ahead and really propel and reward belligerent people in our society. And when you get rewarded, you get money, you get power, you get positions of influence. And in those positions, you're going to go ahead and say, hey, because I'm like this and I'm successful, I'm justifying it. Probably the perfect example of that, and he certainly is amazing, is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs from the very early days is known as not being a nice person. There's all kinds of things that, with his paternity issues to the way he behaved in meetings. And this was both in the first version of Apple as well as when he returned to them. He was known for literally ripping into people and tolerating them. And one of the sentiments that I see all the time is this, he pushed me and we did great things as a result. Here's the thing. You can still get those great results without being belligerent. The problem is we haven't figured out how to do that yet. We don't have enough altruistic leaders like, probably Jack Welch at GE, who knew how to build up this collaboration and build up people without hammering them like a soldier. There are ways to do it. And as far as, kind of our cultural evolution, if we want to get to that point, we're going to first need to figure out that that's what we need to do. And the first way that we're going to do that is by making people accountable for their abusive behavior. One of the things that I recommend is the problem in corporations is that you have an HR director or even a chief people officer. And most all the time, if not every time, they report to the CEO. And the problem is at that point, they're now operating in the best interest of the business. And it's in the best interest of the business to enable peak performers, even if they're belligerent. What we really need is a chief people officer who is appointed by the board of directors and the shareholders, who is answerable to them, and have them as a partner to the CEO. In the end, we need this kind of dynamic combination of yin and yang, where the CEO is acting in the best interest of the company, and a CPO, Chief People Officer, is acting in the best interest of the employees. Now, why do we know that this works well? Because, we have 100,000 years of evolution that says it works well. Because this is exactly the mentality that works in the household, right? The reason that our species, Homo sapiens, are successful is because this dynamic of group collaboration with its team members at top, working and pushing against each other, that puts things into balance. The father working towards performance, taking care of the future, making sure that, being the breadwinner, and I'm not talking about, stereotypical things, because again, the woman and the mother can do that these days. But I'm talking about historically, certainly thousands of years ago, and even, the past century. There needs to be a person who performs and is pushed. But at the same time, that person has to have these nurturing qualities. They shouldn't be allowed to be belligerent. And we have to stake our claim and say two things can coexist. We can get great performances and quality out of people without punishing them, without being in a capricious mode. Yes, it is effective. But the thing is, in order to, move to the third millennium and to grow up as an information technology society, as a service-based society, we need to value these soft skills. We need to start calling out behavior and calling it abuse. Identifying that is going to be the biggest watershed, because that's going to start to change the mentality of people. When we don't call behavior abusive, we enable it. So if we start calling it out in society and start to set up these structures, certainly a chief people officer in an organization, and really just in general, having someone who measures what the soft skills are of a person, not just taking performance, but also looking at how do they interact with other people, and seeing them as equal assets, equally important, and both needed for a healthy, functional family and for a healthy, functional organization. Right now, we reward performance. We allow men to do bad things and sometimes celebrate it. Because as long as they're a genius and you're creating great products and they're building billion-dollar companies, well, we're going to kind of let them get away with it. And that's really sad because to some extent, what we're doing is saying, okay, I know you're behaving poorly, but I'm getting some benefit of it, and I'm going to let you do it. We need to stop that. The last thing I kind of want to recommend is, or talk about, is how we get accountability. One of the tough things to realize in modern society is that accountability works with proximity. And, keeping things secret and private is not really helpful to us. If you look back, let's say 1,000 years, when we lived in small villages, and certainly 4,000 and 5,000 years when clans and tribes ruled the world, right? This dynamic worked well. When you have a group of 30 or 40 people, and everybody knows everybody, and everybody is dependent upon everybody else, right? You start to get this, multi-generational extended family support team that works to make sure that we treat everyone properly. Because now, when you're in a small group like that, if you're bullying someone else and that person's going to, become a basket case or not really perform up to, to their potential because of it, you're going to pay a price. And in modern society, when people are marginalized, you and I kind of don't pay the price. We might be walking to the park and seeing a bunch of tets of people experiencing homelessness. We might know that there is a bad part of town, a ghetto, whatever, where people aren't living well and they're living in poverty. They're food insecure. They have maybe a lot of violence going on in the neighborhood. We know it exists and we may be outraged by it, but we're not really doing anything about it. So accountability requires a proximity. So one of the things we need to do, as far as this whole poverty thing, is we need to recognize that segregating these people out is part of the problem. We need to integrate these people back into our society. And however fashion that doesn't mean building affordable housing, because affordable housing is really the enemy. Affordable housing is really good for us. It enables us to not have to see it. But still, even though these people have a shelter and they might have a space now, their lives are not going to improve because that proximity of people who are expecting good behavior is not going to be there. If you take a bunch of poor people and put them together, right, they're struggling because of some behavior issues. But if you start to integrate them into larger groups where people own the homes and they are making good money and they have nice things, right? Certain things that they're going to get away with from a behavior standpoint and the lower income housing is not going to be tolerated. And that's what we need to do. But again, going back to the, how that gets done, that needs to not be done in this kind of punitive fashion. We need to not, put people down because they're not achieving things, right? They're not lazy, right? They haven't learned how to collaborate and work with other people. They haven't learned emotional regulation, But when they're in a group and, a larger group is behaving a certain way, they can start to learn those skills. By putting them in some affordable housing, facility, that's not going to happen, right? We need to integrate them into businesses, into social groups, into communities where they can learn the standards that we should all be upheld to. So I'm going to kind of leave it with this, with a quick summary. We need to start identifying what is abusive behavior. Passive or aggressive, we need to call it out in society. Everyone knows and agrees that abusive behavior is not acceptable in any form and it is never justified. And we need to start calling it out for what it is. Then we also need to start to realize that we are doing things that enable that poor behavior. And a lot of that comes down to what we do from a law enforcement standpoint as well as from a corporate standpoint. And in both instances, we need to represent the victims. We need to not look down at them as being people who are weak and are not tough enough and are kind of need help from others. We need to look at them as calling out the undesirable behavior and recognize that, everyone needs to be respected at a certain level. Addiction, drugs should not be a criminal offense. That should be a mental health issue. And we're starting to move in that direction, especially here in Oregon. So at some point in the future, we're going to start to realize that when we allow an adult or a person to become an adult, and they don't have the ability to take care of themselves or to treat others with respect, we have failed as a society. Yes, the parents have failed. Yes, the schools have failed. But in the end, it's in all our best interest to have everyone operating at some minimum level. If a person is unemployed, that is not their problem, right? They're gonna, potentially, keep doing what they're doing because they don't know how to get out of it. So we have to look at these as, mental health issues and not in a derogatory method. We need to look at it as it is our goal as a society to make sure that every single person establishes some basic level of emotional wellness. And if we can't do that, that's our fault. If a person is not emotionally well and is having a mental health issue, they're probably not going to help themselves. Telling them to go off and fix it or get therapy, which they probably don't have access to in the first place, doesn't make a lot of sense, right? We want to figure out how we can build them up and take on our responsibility. So buy less paintings, buy less, $300,000 cars. Let's spend more money in people. Let's stop building statues to ourselves and celebrating billionaires. Let's stop looking at all these ridiculously wealthy people as icons and mythical, geniuses, when in fact, we're only rewarding performance. We need to start to reward people who know how to build other people. Not just build companies, but build people. That's the next frontier. If we want things to settle down in our society, we need to change this dynamic and figure out what can we do to change all these social ills that are going on. And I can tell you that from my perspective, there's one thing that's undermining it all, and that's all tolerating abuse. Not identifying it in families, letting them get away with it, enabling it in some ways, and really, not making people accountable. The clans and tribes worked. When you had people together in a group, they first of all knew what was going on when abuse was occurring, and number two, it was in their vested interest to do something about it. So in the city and larger groups today, that doesn't happen. So we need to know how to make accountability intentional. It normally happened in small groups, and it doesn't happen today. And until we start to eradicate abuse, identify it, eradicate it, set up these structures where we can, start to give victims and people who are the recipients of abuse a voice and an ability to stop the behavior, until we start to put those structures into place on a very wide community scale, we're not going to change things. So we can have the Me Too movements, the Occupy Wall Street, the Black Lives Matter, whatever movement you care about, right? Until we start to make these structural changes as far as, starting to make people accountable and stopping, the celebrating performance without looking at the soft skills, the importance of them, until we change that dynamic, start putting chief people officers in our corporation, things are not going to change. I was kind of rambling today, but I hope you get some idea of the message I was trying to point out. Abuse is a pet peeve of mine. If I can get people to start talking more about it, then I've done my job. I have solutions for it. I can tell you how to remediate the behavior, but that's less important than starting to make abuse become a topic of discussion in our national dialogue. When we see that in the media, when we see that in the movies, when we start to identify that in schools, in offices, in communities, then we're really going to start to have a discussion is what do we do next? But until we start to identify it and starting to push back on the bullies and these belligerent people, nothing's going to change. Thank you for watching. Please help me spread the word about abuse. We need to stop it, and we can. Thank you for listening.